Good evening and welcome. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to an evening to mark the launch of Alfred Wiener's The Fatherland and the Jews, brought to you by JW3 in association with Granta Books and the Wiener Library. Our building on the Finchley Road is not closed. Since the beginning of the pandemic, it has functioned as the largest hub for food banks in North Camden. And almost 100,000 meals now have been prepared by volunteers in our demonstration kitchen and delivered locally through homeless shelters and local mutual aid groups. Meanwhile, our cultural programme at JW3 is currently online, and through our website you can find a rich offering of performances, screening, classes, courses, book launches, discussions and more. And more are uploaded every day, so do have a look. On to tonight. It's a privilege to host the launch of a text written a century ago, which has only today been published in English by the wonderful Granta Books. And Granta are offering a 10% discount if you purchase a copy within the next 48 hours. So we're going to post the link in the chat now and at the end of the event as well. The perspective of the text is remarkably astute, and it provides an insight into that interwar moment and to the legacy of Alfred Wiener's approach. And the timing of this publication is, of course, disarmingly prescient. We've assembled a very fine panel who will be examining this for you, with you. And if you have questions, then our host will let you know when to ask them. There's a Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see, and that's how you can submit your questions. I will introduce you to tonight's chair, and he in turn will introduce you to the panel. So tonight's chair is Dr. Toby Simpson. He is director of the Wiener Holocaust Library and has been in post since October 2019. He first became aware of the library's work whilst writing his PhD in history and was immediately struck by its unique and extraordinary history and mission and their collections. Over the past decade, the library's online audiences have expanded by an order of magnitude, and prior to lockdown, the number of people visiting was at an all-time high. The Wiener Library, as it was originally known, was founded by Dr. Alfred Wiener in Amsterdam in 1933. And in 2017, the library was designated status as a collection of outstanding national significance. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Toby Simpson.
Thank you, Michaela, for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank JW3 for hosting this partnered event this evening, which promises to be fascinating and enlightening. And I also want to thank JW3 for the wonderful work you're doing during lockdown. The library is also closed physically, but its virtual doors are open, and we've just launched a brand new website. So I would encourage you to visit the website and to check out all of the exciting online resources that we have, but also the amazing events that we're running throughout the winter and the spring. So I want to start by expressing my joy at the publication of this wonderful book, The Fatherland and the Jews, which is the first of a lasting collaboration between Granta Books and the Wiener Holocaust Library. It's a proud moment for me and the whole team at the library to see the first publication come to fruition. And it's been a great experience from the beginning. It started as a germ of an idea, and it's come together into a tangible, beautiful thing. It's a really lovely book. So I will, of course, be talking more about the contents. And I want to thank first, before we go into that, the many people who worked with us on creating this book. Of course, two of our panelists tonight, Michael Berkowitz and Danny Finkelstein, who wrote the introduction and foreword respectively. I'll come back to them in a moment to introduce them. But I also want to thank the former director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, Ben Barco, who proposed the idea of the book in discussion with Sigrid Rousing and Anthony Landers, and he did a wonderful job of creating a clear and accurate translation of Alfred Wiener's original German works into English. I also want to thank Prue Rowlandson, Sam Poulton, Noel Murphy, and of course, Dr. Sigrid Rousing at Granta. Among the library staff, many of whom have made an important contribution, I especially want to thank Dr. Christine Schmidt, who commented on the introduction and made some very important comments. So it's my fantastic pleasure and great honor to be chairing an hour of discussion with three learned speakers about this book, The Fatherland and the Jews, two pamphlets by Alfred Wiener, 1919 and 1924. Joining us this evening are Professor Michael Berkowitz, Professor of Jewish History at UCL, Professor Jean Seaton, Professor of Media History at the University of Westminster and the Director of the Orwell Foundation, and Lord Daniel Finkelstein, who is a Conservative peer, a leading political columnist, and of course, very importantly, in the context of this evening's discussion, grandson of Alfred Wiener. Thank you to all the panelists for joining. We've got a lot to discuss. We're aiming to reserve some time at the end for questions. Please do post in the chat. So I'm going to come first to you, Michael. You have shown an amazing ability in your introduction to sketch history in just a few lines, a few paragraphs. And I wanted to ask you about the first pages of your introduction, which focus on Wiener as a younger man, and also on the Germany of his youth. Of course, that was Wilhelmine Germany, or the Kaiserreich. And something that intrigued me about your writing on this, two interrelated points. So for those who aren't familiar with Wiener's life, he grew up as a proud German Jew, imbued with small c conservative humanistic values. And I think it's easy enough for someone who knows a bit about European history to imagine Wiener in that sense. But there's another surprising fact in his early life, which might strike the modern reader. We learned through your introduction that Wiener developed a strong interest in the study of medieval Arabic literature. And that was actually the subject of his doctorate, hence Dr. Alfred Wiener. So you hint at a kind of confluence between his passion for literature and his role as a progenitor of the library as a collection. So I just wonder if you could start us off by saying something about Wiener's early life, what it meant to be a German Jew living in the Kaiserreich, and some of the attitudes or ideas that shaped Alfred Wiener as a human being.
Okay, thank you very much, Toby. I appreciate the chance to speak to the panel and the audience this evening, and for having the opportunity to go back to this work and to say something about it. And I should say that I of course never had the pleasure to know or to meet Alfred Wiener, but he was one person away. That is, he was very well known to my own doctoral supervisor, George Mossy, from the University of Wisconsin and Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And although again, he was of an earlier generation, I wouldn't have known people of that time, but it's a world that I think we really do as historians have something of a handle on. That is, he was born in 1885, and already at the turn of the century, there was something to what we can call, say, sort of Jewish consciousness, which meant that you didn't have to be necessarily very religiously observant or orthodox in a traditional way to be sort of interested in Jews in the Jewish world. And it often happened around this time that people were interested in Jewish things also got interested in what we now call the Middle East or the Near East. That is, if you were interested in Hebrew, sometimes you got interested in Arabic or Turkish and Islam, or maybe origins of Christianity. There are all sorts of roots to it. But from what we know, growing up in Potsdam and then Benchen, which is actually in Poznan to the east, he was interested in Jewish things, and he was thinking of studying Jewish subjects, and he did this at university. Even at one point thought he might become a rabbi, but it seems that didn't last for very long. He was more sort of interested in Jewish things in Hebrew in an academic way. But then his life took a little different turn, as these things often do, when he had an illness, and it was recommended that he spend some time in a warm climate. And he wound up spending time in Arabic speaking places and got really, really interested in it. And he wound up, doing a PhD on this 9th and 10th century Arabic literature that dealt with sort of distress and how people overcame their problems. So he dealt with this sort of very deeply humanistic Arabic literature. And I think he had a great love for the Jewish people, but he had a great love for people generally, and he tended to appreciate different kinds of civilizations. And I think he probably had a sense he wanted to do something political, but also sort of have his hand in things academic and intellectual as well. So in some ways, it makes a lot of sense that when he finished his PhD, went to work for this organization called the Hilfsverein, which dealt with Jewish sort of education and culture in the Near East, which was not, however, Zionist. That is, that wasn't the tack that he took. He knew it very, very well, but that was really where he was starting to work with this man, Paul Nathan, who also was connected to this Central Organization of German Jews. So just to say, he was very, very interested in the world generally. That is, he was interested in local politics and things more general, but also sort of history of Jews, how they related to the world and other peoples. And he wanted to get deeply into it, so deeply into it as to learning the languages and the culture, even from much earlier periods. And I think there really was this confluence between concerns.
And those language skills actually shaped his life at a crucial juncture during the First World War, as he's posted to the Near East and did some translation work. And we learn in your introduction about him being awarded the Iron Cross, and like so many other Jews in Germany, his patriotism was then grotesquely betrayed there afterwards. So you mentioned about the Hilfsverein and Paul Nathan. I wonder if you could also just say something briefly about Wiener's work after the First World War, that is a turning point in his life to a certain extent, and also perhaps explain a bit about the Zentralverein, which became a crucial organization in his career.
Well, as you said, this really was very important. I think that sometimes it takes, the military takes an army a little while to figure out how they can make better use of people, and eventually they figured out, particularly because the war developed into a world war. I mean, that was the Great War, and it became known as World War I because it was literally all over the world, and there was a need for people who knew languages like Arabic and Turkish. I mean, this was really incredibly important. And I think there are times we don't appreciate these kinds of holes in knowledge, and there aren't really that many people who can do it. And I'll jump ahead because I think it's a really important point. In the beginning of the Second World War, Britain's own knowledge about Germany, even really basic things, had huge holes. And there were the kinds of information that they were only able to get from Dr. Wiener's library and absolutely nowhere else, because nobody had been interested in collecting this kind of material. And you could say, oh, there are, great libraries in the country, whatever, but nobody had it outside of the Wiener Library itself. But in some ways, it made an awful lot of sense that he went to work for this organization, which was concerned with sort of improving the conditions of Jews wherever they were. And he obviously liked to write. He liked to be involved. So this is an organization in some ways has gotten a lot of bad press, because I'd say probably from the 70s on, it was always seen as the organization that was opposed to Zionism, and is very often caricatured as being very myopic, or sort of being ultra assimilationist, or always caving in. And I think one of the things these writings show is that this really wasn't true. That is, they were very proud as Jews. They obviously had a different orientation to the Zionist movement. They also didn't think that Jews shouldn't be involved in the Near East. They thought Jews should be involved in different parts of the world, but involved in a different way. But this was a really significant organization, and we mostly now see it for its sort of failings, that it couldn't really meet the challenge, particularly after 1933. But I think we now have a lot of scholarship that's shown that many of the things it was doing in terms of protecting Jews legally and making arguments, and in some ways sort of helping Jews to think about themselves and their own place in German society. And one of the things I've been thinking about a little bit more, which I really should have put into the really could have put into the introduction, is I think that Wiener was actually really helpful with getting getting Jews to think about the possibility of having to be in other places and what they would need to do in order to do that. Although they weren't sort of pushing immigration, he really helped to sort of expand a view of the world. Then the other thing, of course, which he did, which will come up, I think, in a little while, was that without saying, get out of here, he said there are things going on in this society which are incredibly alarming, and we really have to be attuned to it.
Yeah. And that's what the pamphlets bring out in such extraordinary and unsettling clarity. If I could just pull the lens back a little bit and turn to Professor Seaton. Michael has alluded to the agonizing defeat of Germany in the First World War, and of course the perception of the unfairness of the Treaty of Versailles, which was very widespread. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that moment in history of defeat of Germany in the First World War, but not so much from the perspective of an individual, but broader society. Michael talks in his introduction about a kind of resistance to accept the outcome in Germany that was quite deep-seated. So could you help us understand why the impact of the First World War was so seismic?
But I'd just like to say, first of all, that it's just because I want to say it, it's the most beautiful, fascinating book. It's been beautifully translated. I think it must be Wiener's voice. It's not a terribly elegant voice, but in the first essay, it's rather a pungent voice. And in the second essay, and I really like to go back to the relationship between those two, it's quite a sad voice, actually. And I think the translation has caught very sensitively, actually, as sort of the real voice of Wiener. So I just wanted to say the whole project is absolutely fascinating. I mean, one of the many ways in which these two pamphlets might make us feel cautious and alarmed now is that the First World War provided this very big, very terrifying emotional shock across all societies that were involved in it. And emotional shocks have aftermaths. They have impact. And we don't know what the aftermath of the pandemic will be, but for sure there will be one, because you can't inject terror into everybody and hope that everybody will go back to being sort of Mary Poppins afterwards, even if we weren't in a terribly Mary Poppins moment. So one of the things that I think Wiener picks up and he's out of is this: the First World War produced a huge shock across all societies, and that led to different degrees of acceptance and non-acceptance of what had happened in the First World War. And of course, in Germany, it's always, it did in France as well, actually. You produce answers for why you have or haven't been defeated, because that's a sort of human thing to do. And it really depends on your leaders, how that is then led and defined and accepted. So of course, as it were, after the Second World War, it's not till you get to de Gaulle really that he reasserts something about France. So in Germany, and there were real conditions for this interpretation. On the whole, fantastic ideas also have one nasty rootlet in reality. It was that, in a sense, they hadn't really lost. They'd been stabbed in the back. They would have gone on fighting. I have to say that we had in Britain our own fantasies. Propaganda had been very successful. We believed, there were real atrocities conducted by the Germans during the First World War, but we believed the Daily Mail carried extraordinary stories of atrocities. So we also had fantasies about, even though we were successful. And that was partly because, you could look down a street in some cities in Germany and some cities in Paris and some cities in Britain, in which all of the men, there's a very famous account of a street in Liverpool, in which the postman goes down and he gives a letter, a telegram to every single house you take out people, because that's how people were fighting, town by town, at that kind of level, people have very extraordinary reactions to that. So Wiener is coming back, you know, he's dealing with a society which has had a huge trauma and which has a fantasy, which is a helpful fantasy, sort of, for assimilating the shock of the First World War. But because it's rather chaotically and terribly led, there is no coming to terms with that defeat. I have to say, the myths about the First World War, which were propagated in Britain, were one of the causes of the foundation of the BBC in the way that it came to be founded. That's, say, by accident, you might say, it produced a dedication to more accurate knowledge.
I'd love to come back to that, actually, because part of the discussion that I'd like to get to is this whole question of how we try to follow in Wiener's footsteps, in a sense, in challenging myths and insisting on good information. But if I could go back perhaps with Danny a little bit to talk about Alfred Wiener himself, and just in your foreword, one of the things that you point out is that one of Wiener's remarkable qualities is his ability, unlike some of his contemporaries, to face uncomfortable truths. And he, of course, was a German patriot, and yet he was able to see the worst of what was happening in Germany. So I just wondered if you might want to speak a little bit about that, but I've noticed you're on mute, so you might need to just quickly unmute before. There we are.
Sorry, I thought you wouldn't want my children's guitar lesson. They've stopped now. Yes, thank you very much, and it was a privilege to listen to the other contributors, and obviously to have this incredible book. And I'm delighted that Grant have done it. I'm very grateful to Ben Barco for having the idea and driving on the translation, and a remarkable thing has been done. And these are pieces of work I wouldn't otherwise have been able to read myself, because unfortunately don't speak German. Quite interesting in itself. You're quite right. I think one of the most interesting things about Alfred Wiener is that he was able to hold two thoughts in his mind. One is that he believed that being a German and being a Jew had certain qualities in common that made them deeply compatible. And he was able simultaneously to recognize that the two were not compatible and that they were diverging. And that is a rare ability, because when people have an idea as tenaciously as he held the one that he did, and he expressed it in many ways about in his campaigns on Zionism and other issues, when they have that view, it's very difficult for them to then also think, well, actually, at some level, this deep thing that I hold isn't true. And I think that's very impressive. It was interesting when Jean said that some of his writing wasn't elegant. I think more true of the first than of the second of those two essays. And absolutely true and very important. They're urgent pieces of journalism and political propaganda rather than stylistic pieces, in my opinion. And one of the things that I've learned over time is, although my grandfather was obsessed with books and the printed word, and he really believed in it, he and my mother always told loads of stories about him coming back from bookshops, and they were being relieved that he'd only have a few books, and then a taxi would arrive with the rest of the on that trip. So he was obsessed with the written word, but the library was primarily a political project, and his interest in this issue was political rather than literary, and he was primarily, I think, political rather than literary. He was deeply intellectual, and fascinatingly for me anyway, my father became intellectual in almost exactly the same way, a way that is impossible for it to be in coincidence. I know that my grandfather was an influence on my father, but I think that's quite interesting to me anyway. His intellectual bent of mind passed itself on to other people. It was part of his character, part of his personality. But I think in respect to the work he was doing in the library, in the work that's reflected in this book, it's primarily political rather than literary. And the final point, before passing back to you, is the other thing that's important about the first of the two essays, and Michael brings this out, I think, is very well, is that what he was dealing with at that point were what people might regard as fringe movements.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is these fringe movements are not as fringe as you think, and their fringeness is more important than you think. That, of course, turned out to be completely correct and vitally important, and is the most prescient part of his book. And we're all living through an age where we're discovering that transmission mechanism, right? That the ideas of small groups of fringe people passed to other people. We think that this is a facet of social media, and I think this book illustrates it isn't. That it's a facet of ideas. I use this phrase that people always say, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And Alfred Wiener profoundly believed that was untrue, and I'm sure he was right.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm sure the other panelists would too. I just wanted to move then the discussion onto the pamphlets themselves, and starting with Prelude to Pogroms, Facts for Thoughtful People. Michael, you talk about the sense in which these pamphlets revealed evidence of systematic dissemination of anti-Semitic propaganda, but they also do more than that. They point to a disturbing culture. You talk about George Mosse describing this as the crisis of German ideology, but at the time this hadn't been historicized. This was a sort of a flood of misinformation, which had a disturbing, irrational character that Wiener, but also some other contemporaries picked up on. So I wonder if you could, in the context of the pamphlet itself, specifically Prelude to Pogroms, what did Alfred Wiener fear might happen, and in what sense did those things actually happen, and in what sense were they exceeded or didn't happen? It would be really interesting to hear you comment on that.
Well, I think his most immediate fear was that there were going to be attacks against Jews, in terms of pogroms, what we generally associate with Eastern Europe around the turn of the century, but also there was this huge wave of pogroms that were part of the the Russian Revolution, Civil War, the wars involving Poland and the Ukraine. That we've almost lost sight of the huge numbers of Jews killed there. And I think that he was partly afraid that there might be some sort of attempt to cross the border, or some of these things that were going on as far as agitation in order to redress the political grievances, that it might result in pogroms, particularly in border areas. But I think that what happened was, it wasn't pogroms in the East European sense, but there were loads of political murders that occurred. That is, hundreds of political murders. And people often said, oh, it's left and right, but it was actually extremely imbalanced, that it was overwhelmingly on the side of the right, as opposed to the left that really used this as a horrible instrument. And of course, the most striking is Walter Rathenau, the economic minister. But just to go back a little bit, the kind of audience that he was talking to, there were things he felt he didn't really have to explain in depth. That is, he never really went into detail about the big lie of the stab in the back. He didn't have to do it, because most of the people he was talking to knew that this was a huge lie, that Germany really did lose the war. It couldn't go on fighting. It had no more capacity. So the country was breaking apart. It wasn't a conventional loss, the way that people think of losses on, say, the battlefield, but they lost the war. When a country produce, armaments, you can't keep fighting. I mean, when you can't keep feeding your people, you can't go on with this. But I think that the thing that really was really beginning to gnaw at him was this folkish agitation, which in some ways, and I hope not to get you into trouble, but I think it's probably the best example. It's kind of like QAnon. This is crazy. This is something that's utterly insane. These people who believe this believe in a quasi-mystical religious garbage, which they've applied to politics. And I'd say to this very, in the United States, even the most astute journalists, people are kind of shy about talking about this. We now have people in Congress who believe in it. This is crazy. How can Republicans stand for this? What's the matter with them? This is really, really crazy. So this is part of what was driving him nuts. How can people call themselves conservatives or conservative nationalists and accept this kind of utter craziness, which is mixed between anti-immigrant and more traditional anti-Semitic stuff? And his audience knew what he was talking about when he dropped this term folkish. And this is really what I tried to explain. And it really wasn't until my own teacher, George Mossey, in 1964, that this was explained to the world. And people said, oh, it's just a catalog of kooks. How can you take this? How can you take this seriously? Well, we do have to take it seriously when it actually is one of the engines that is, however, you say from the outside, driving a political agenda.
Yes, that's one of the uncanny things about reading this. It almost teleports you back into that moment. And we feel it today, the frustration of hearing things where you just are shocked. You think this is crazy, this cannot stand. And yet not only does it stand, but it has this terrifying ability to propagate. So actually, I wanted to come to Jean and Danny on that issue. You mentioned about political violence. So in certain respects, in interwar Germany, we're dealing with a different order of magnitude. But we see pitfalls of the past stumbled into again, an inability to starve political violence of the oxygen of publicity, for example. So I just wonder, one of Wiener's ideas is this, that we need to support good ideas, challenge bad ones. But I just wonder about that point about political violence and how it sort of fuels, and how anger seems to fuel an almost exponential attention. So I just would be interested in Jean and Danny's thoughts on that. Perhaps you first, Jean?
I want us to raise something else. I don't think you do starve violence of oxygen, though I understand why governments want to sometimes. I think there's a really difficult issue, and journalism, in my view, has to report it. You can't bury it. There's a very, very interesting sort of set of judgments to be done. I think that I really wanted to ask Danny a question about the relationship between the first pamphlet, which is rather caustic and angry and sort of powerful, and the second one, which feels to me he's on his life's course. He's going to document this stuff. And the tone, actually, even though it's more dangerous in a way in 24, it's as if there's a very interesting interaction between them, leaving aside, I think, the real fury that comes over in the first pamphlet, which is, his war record, other Jews' war record, this simple lie about cowardice. You feel his anger. And the other thing I'd say is that the first pamphlet is almost like a set piece in how to run a success. He's identifying how a successful propaganda campaign works. I wondered if E.H. Carr had read it when he was writing about the role of pamphlets during the Civil War. Also very brilliant analysis of propaganda being taken over, but it's got individuals. You have to have pamphlets, you have to have meetings. They can't have a meeting. It runs straight into the beginning of the real serious understanding and analysis of the mass media and the propaganda by people like Lazarsfeld in America in the 1930s. They're really trying to pull apart how you change people's opinions. Because in a way, that's the first topic. The first topic is, why do people believe this stuff? And the second one is, it's much more about the library. It's on the way to the library.
Yeah, so I think you're quite right to notice the difference in tone. The first is really making one simple argument, which is, look at all this that's going on and please don't ignore it. it really is happening. And whereas in the second, he takes to some extent as read that people do know, the audience he's speaking to knows that are happening, but he's trying to take apart the arguments that are then being made. And so it is a different tone. And I think it's right. I think it is just due to him beginning to realize that he was going to have to spend his life making these arguments. So I think that's a wise observation on his work and the difference between the two. The most interesting facet of his life is this. We often discuss this when we're discussing the library, Toby. The question of the belief in the power of truth. That and definitely was his extremely strong view, and he also thought truth was could be found in the written word and printed word, and he believed in that very strongly. And in many ways, he was correct for two reasons. One is because, as we all know, if truth goes, you lose everything, and his work pays testimony to that. And secondly, ultimately, the truth that he collected was vital in the eradication of Nazis in the post-war era, the trials, and now in our continuing work. We weren't to know, maybe he would have been distressed to discover that we're still having debates about whether this really happened and exactly what it's comparable to even now. So I think that is a clear argument for this power of truth work. But one also has to recognize, he ended up in exile. His country was taken over by the Nazis he was trying to fight with his power of truth. His wife was killed. His children were imprisoned. He never, ended up being a British citizen for all his Germanness. So the power of truth only took you so far. And we face that now in the issue with Donald Trump, actually. So when I heard Joe Biden's address yesterday, and I've done a lot of speech writing, and I thought it was good speech without it being brilliant. I thought it was good. But I did think it made an intellectual, I thought it made an intellectual, a political mistake, and that was to put so much emphasis on unity, only because he's not in charge of getting unity. And at some point, accompanying the power of truth, I think you have to resolve that the supporters of liberal democratic institutions are going to resist those who don't accept liberal democratic institutions, and that while freedom to express people's views and needs to be extended as far as it possibly can be, when people have departed that method of doing so, you have to be strong enough to recognize that. And I do think, the lesson of his defeat as well as his victories needs to be absorbed when we're dealing with any recurrence of this sort of behavior.
Yes. And
I mean, Wiener's very moving because he is all of the stuff about, very complicated stuff about, Jews in Germany are fantastic. They didn't do that. They did do this. They're not perfect. They're ordinary people. His relationship to philo-Semitism, the sort of sense that he really rejected identity politics.
Yeah,
I thought what I found really, really moving, because he's paying a high price. He's going to pay a high price.
it's totally tragic.
Really sophisticated views.
It's totally tragic what happened to him, that he lost his his Germanness. Yeah. So I've told this story at the library before, but maybe not everyone will have heard it. When my mother was on the Gripsholm, which was a Red Cross ship going to the United States, where Alfred Wiener was going to meet them, they'd left Belsen. My grandmother had died. They had with him his First World War medals, which they'd used in Belsen. I've often told this story by saying they were useless. I now understand they weren't useless, actually. They played some sort of role, actually, and they were helpful to have. But they thought, we can't go into America with these German war medals. So they threw them in the water by that Statue of Liberty. That was on their way out. So, and my grandfather was upset about this, and I couldn't understand, well, why would he be upset about losing these stupid war medals? Well, I'm going to understand him. The denial of his Germanness was pretty much a denial of him, and it cut very deep. It was also a denial of truth, which he also didn't like.
And I suppose also he'd been fighting against this for, since these pamphlets were published. And Michael, you mentioned about Dietrich Eckart and Wiener's efforts, which again is almost tragic to read, just to think of the impossibility of trying to challenge these myths which are being promoted by completely irrational people who are not interested in the value of truth whatsoever. Sorry, Michael. Are you?
Oh, sure. Toby, I just wanted to go back, and this relates to a number of the other panelists' comments. And I think it's really important to go back to the time period that is 1919. Again, there was a great fear that there might be pogroms, but the time of the second pamphlet, there had been at that point sort of two major insurrections, although there were all sorts of smaller things that had happened in Germany. But there was the Cat Putsch, and then there was the Beer Hall Putsch that was led by Hitler, who he doesn't mention at all. But it's a kind of thing that, even like to say, the comments of Danny Finkelstein, of course you're thinking about this attempted siege of the Capitol and Charlottesville, related to Trump, but you're not saying it explicitly. Well, there were things that he wasn't saying explicitly, which everyone in his audience knew. And at that moment, it seemed as if things were settling down, that the Nazis were more quiet. But it would be, I'll give you a horrible, Hitler was about to go on trial. And it was thought that he would be in prison for a long time, that, these really weird right-wing people would sort of be put in their place. And that isn't what happened. That is, he was allowed to grandstand. He wound up increasing his reputation. He wrote Mein Kampf in this period. And he got further, or he improved his position. But what really made them go was something nobody had any control over. It was the worldwide depression. If it wasn't for the depression, all of this stuff wouldn't have come back. Because, say, between 1926 and 29, the Weimar Republic was doing a lot better. There were reasons why Jews weren't thinking very much about going somewhere else. And again, we really do have to go back to look at the time. It wasn't as if, he was just such a German patriot that his head was in the sand. That is, reasonable thinking people said things might actually work out, or there's better chances going to work out. But then they were sort of hit by this. So again, this is part of the reason why he had the kind of tone that he had. That is, something really scary had happened, but it seemed as if, it seemed as if they might be over it. So he was sort of analyzing the situation as it was without going into that specific incident.
Yes. That's often something we have to sort of try and recover, is that sense of, not being able to know what would happen next. And I'd be interested to sort of think about the media environment in a way, because we have to project ourselves back to a very different time. And of course, there are parallels to what's happening today, but this was also quite a different world in certain respects. Wiener was dealing with pamphlets, and in fact, one of the things that he was brilliant at was realizing the significance of collecting things that other people were not collecting. So I just, things that other people thought of as rubbish. So I just wonder if perhaps that might be a good time to turn to you, Gina, just to sort of think about the media environment that Wiener was operating with.
Well, but it's also quite important to say that, there's a wonderful aspect to Wiener, which I'm sure Danny could comment on, of being a chap who collects things. He has a wonderful obsession with things, and indeed with trivial things. And trivial things, a lot of post-war history has been concerned with trivial things and making it important. I think that the important thing to understand is that, really from the, that you'd had great newspapers since basically the 1880s, both in Germany and Britain, and their role in a sense was to operate as shepherd dogs for mass new voting publics. But pamphlets remained really, really important aspect of publishing, the left was publishing pamphlets, everybody was publishing pamphlets, and quite often as it happened, you know, that you try and put down the printers, but somebody else will pop up because you can make money with pamphlets. So pamphlets were the TikTok of now. You could make money on something quite small, and they were very ubiquitous. And what's interesting is that broadcasting, which is about, you know, films have taken off and have already become very popular. And it's very interesting, in the last essay, he talks about the film industry. And the last essay is really interesting, that he goes through the media. So films were perceived already as either dangerous and therefore propagandist. So you all had to go and, you know, sit in places where you couldn't sit next to women and all sorts of things, and they had to be clean. So films were already seen as really important, and of course there were great films by then. So he's living in a very rich media environment. The one thing that hasn't yet really taken off is broadcasting, and he doesn't really talk about that because it's going to blow all of these other things out of the water. So it's like all medium, including, you know, social media. They're not biased one way or the other. It depends how people use them. And sadly, bad people and good people use them with different degrees of agility at different times. But I really want to say that pamphlets are really interesting, because you have to organize around pamphlets. You have to sell them. So they produce around themselves quite rich clusters for propaganda.
It's so, you're quite right about him being a collector. Somewhat spooky thing for me. He died when I was 1.5 years old. So although I know that he picked me up, I didn't know him. And obviously I lived in the ambiance he created because I was so close to my mom. But the truth is, I've become a liberal conservative, a liberal Jew, with a political interest that I combine with journalistic interest. But I'm very interested in its impact on ideas in the real world. And I'm a ferocious collector of things. You know, I have a collection, for example, of the letters of prime ministers, you know, which is just sitting behind me over there. And the more that I read about him, the more I think to myself, my goodness, we are really genetic products in an amazing way. And I read about him, and suddenly I think, oh my goodness, that's exactly me, and I didn't know him, you know, really. So I've got a sort of intuition for him, and that also gives me an intuition about his politics too. You know, because I have the same attitude to Britain, I think, as he's probably had to Germany, and I hope the illusion will not prove, you know, as problematic, and maybe because he did think there was this you know, confluence between being a German and being a Jew. It was a very important part of his thinking. I started to study more about it, and it was, you know, completely not how the Germans thought of it. But I think I think this whole strand of thought, the assimilationist Jews before Zionism, you know, after when religious liberalism was beginning, but before Zionism, that whole period is a really interesting period. And in addition to his work on fascism, this was important, and the two can't be separated, actually. He was trying to save his concept of Germany and of the confluence of German Judaism by repelling the Nazis.
But wasn't he also, which is also very resonant, he was a patriot, but he was an anti-nationalist.
Yeah.
That,
you know,
that to me felt very, very stark at the moment, because
the proudest thing I've, you know, I'm generally, the family's incredibly proud of what he did for historic reasons, but I think we all felt very proud when we came across, a friend just sent it to me actually, and I sent it to Toby, his statement upon retiring as director of the library, in which he said how important the color bar was for Jews to campaign against. And I was so happy that he'd understood, you know, that this was not just about Jews and Judaism, and I think he did understand it was about the nature of liberal societies, and that was because of this relationship between his idea of nation and his idea of religion. You couldn't say to save the Jews was to save Germany. That's a very important part of his thinking, and it led him on to these other thoughts.
Just, I wanted to ask a broader question of all of you before I ask a short question to finish off. The broader question is about Wiener as, I suppose, as a writer and as a figure for us to look back on and to learn from. This is the first book published, with Wiener's writings in English, which I think is an amazing milestone. And we've got the exciting prospect of potential further publications with grant of Wiener's other writings. But at the same time, there is this emotionally resonant aspect of, after the Holocaust, he didn't write as much. And so that's partly because of, not feeling necessarily that he found his voice in the English language. So sort of thinking in that broader sense of his entire life, not that I want to set too difficult a challenge, but I'd like to ask each of you about your thoughts on Wiener as a man and as a writer. So perhaps starting with Michael.
I think with regard to your question, he was simply in a very different situation. After coming to London in 1939, after luckily escaping to get to Amsterdam and setting up this, it wasn't actually called the Wiener Library, it was just this Jewish Information Bureau, because that's part of what the CV had done as well, in terms of simply providing information. But when he was here, as much as in retrospect, we see his library is a really important institution, it was in some ways on the margin, even though it served incredibly important functions, but it wasn't something that people immediately looked at and saw as a really significant institution in the community, and say, if you wanted a spokesperson for something, you would ask the head of this library. That is, no one would have thought of that. They think of, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, of, the chief rabbi, of, who knows what, but it really didn't begin as a central organization. So I'm not sure, and I could be wrong, but I'm not sure if he would have had a platform if he did want to write, because he wasn't actually connected. But I'd say, to their credit, the government knew that he was important. The government knew that the institution was actually really critical. It was used for the Nuremberg trials, again later on for the trial of Adolf Eichmann. But I think, and again, it was appreciated maybe by Jewish refugees and their organization, but the Wiener Library struggled so much that it almost left the country on a couple of different occasions, because let me be very blunt, institutions and individuals did not support it. It almost went away, and it actually split in two for a long period of its time, being in Tel Aviv. So I think that's probably part of the problem in terms of continuing with the kind of writing and the kind of public presentation he had, in addition to obviously thinking about the world and reading about things and putting it together.
I mean, another thing that strikes me about Wiener is he's the most extraordinary cooperator with others. Through his letters, his correspondence is absolutely extraordinary and so extensive, the network that he had, and also his deep and lasting relationships with many other brilliant figures working with the library, Hans Reichmann, Eva Reichmann, Leo Beck. And so that just strikes me as a crucial aspect of Wiener's achievement, is his ability to cooperate effectively with others. Go ahead, sorry.
How I first encountered Wiener was as somebody who was go-to for SOE, for the BBC, for information. And if you see him there, so I think the answer is perhaps that he found his métier. His métier was that these pamphlets and this early writing established a position that was then nullified in a way by the war, but the war gave him this other extraordinary access to giving people information. And if you look in the BBC archives, people go to him for the most extraordinary things, because they know that if he can't find it today, he'll find it by next week. And in that sense, he absolutely was one of the pillars of our capacity to both do black and white propaganda all over all over occupied Europe and in Germany. And so that he was like a Google, He was like an early version of Google. You wanted a problem, you went to him, he'd find the answer. And I think that must have suited him.
Danny.
Well, there are a number of things. First of all, I think it's unavoidable reading this book that he's not a stylist. The second essay is more, the second essay, which is more a speech, is more elegant than the first. What strikes you with the book is its urgency rather than its style. One of the things that's missing from it, and it's frustrating for me in a way, it's a little bit present in the second one, not really in the first, is his humor. Everybody who talks about him says that he was very funny. I mean, by the way, his constant desire to make jokes in not necessarily appropriate situations is another thing that I inherited without knowing, and I was like really staggered when I read about it. So he clearly had that, and I'd love to feel that a bit more, but I don't, you know, it's not. But the third thing is, I think Michael was absolutely right. I think it was partly about spending all of his time organising. The fact that he spent all of his time fundraising, he was really good at it. Ultimately did find, you know, this long fuse of Jim Callahan, which saved that life, because he, you know, the brilliance of spotting that Jim Callahan was a future coming figure, and that of that period, exactly. Very clever thing to have done politically. So that was part of the reason. And the other part of the reason is he was really a German figure rather than an English one, for all that he did in this country, for all that he lived here. I was very struck by the fact that the record of his funeral said that he asked for his funeral to be in German, and that on his coffin was a wreath from the President of Germany. And I have in a file that Ludwig Erhard, who was Chancellor of Germany at the time, called him the greatest German of all emigration. So as he was a towering figure in Germany, actually, but not as big a figure in this country. Of course, now he would be, because of just the way these things work, but he didn't live that long to see that moment. And you know, my mother didn't start talking about the Holocaust to audiences here until I was old enough to remember her doing it, and I was in my teens myself and could give her advice about what to say, because I remember her asking whether I thought that people would be interested in the fact that she knew Anne Frank, and knowing that was quite a funny question at that point. So I must have been old enough to appreciate that. So people just weren't interested in that. So I think that must be the reason why he didn't write it. But what's amazing, given that he's not a stylist, is how interesting the book is. It's a really, because of its context, the dates, and just it's so extraordinary to have written that in 1919. And you know, I'm so happy that we've got it in print in this country, and that people can read that extraordinary work for themselves. Absolutely.
And on that note, I might just ask if there are any questions. Please do post them now in the chat. I noticed there's Michael Horowitz QC was interested in how myths often acquire or require interested and powerful promoters. So I just wonder, coming back to that question of how on earth, perhaps this is a question for Day as well, how on earth do we challenge myths? You know, what are the tools that an activist or a journalist like Wiener needs to do that? What are the good ways of doing it, or the better ways of doing it, and what are the less effective ways of doing it? Does the pamphlets tell us something about that? I know that's quite a difficult question, so I'm sort of tempted to come to you first, Danny, because just to allow the others to have a bit of a think, just because it's sort of within your field. So yes, he does. The argument he puts in the second of these two pamphlets is all about Germany and its character, and he's addressing Germany and its character and trying to explain, and it's a very politically astute publication, the second one, because he's trying to explain to people in his audience why the truth is in their interests, and that is vital. I'm a great believer in what I call excuse me, but give them a fiver school of politics. There's no argument that works quite as well as a fiver in politics. I mean, that's obviously a flippant thing, but basically you have to make sure people understand the argument you're making is in their interests to believe. QAnon, it is in the interests of the people who believe it. Donald Trump didn't believe it, but he encouraged it because it was in his interests to encourage it, and ironically may now no longer be in his interest to encourage it.
the myths that people build, they're in their interest in all sorts of ways, building communities for themselves, creating narratives that allow for their failures and successes to be seen the way they want them to be seen. And the key to unlocking the door is to find ways of making the truth in people's interests to accept. And that is quite politically tricky and may not be possible. But that is, I think, what he was trying to do in the second pamphlet, and I think is the most yielding, the approach most likely to yield result.
I have two more questions. So, did Jean or Michael, would you like to speak on the question of what can be done?
Oh, I think part of what Wiener was talking about was, like Danny was saying, in terms of being realistic, and being presented, well, what is the actual situation, and what might be done about it in terms of where we want to go from here. But then I think one of the things he found really perplexing is, why are people taking up so much time and energy with all of this craziness, which gets them nowhere, with just, the kind of arguments that are utterly absurd, that don't really have answers, or just result in sort of outrageous political postures or actions. So that's part of what was so frustrating. And I think that what he was trying to do was say, look, no matter what you call yourself politically, we've got to get to work and sort of get the society back onto its footing. And this isn't helping to be talking about Jews and race and things that are mystical and redemption of Aryans. What is this? This is nutty. This is not going to do it. We have to deal with, how are we going to deal with the resources that we have, put ourselves on a footing where we can get the country to come back again.
I think that it raises, I think believing in myths raises two problems. One of which is that, and I'm very torn, and perhaps Danny is the person to answer this, quite often myths have a basis in real resentments and real senses of honor that are mobilized for other people's interests. I mean, that's so they are not necessarily just phantoms. They're phantoms that call on something that's real in people. My problem is that, and you feel that in the second essay, which I think is a fantastically considered bit of sociology in a way, is that you have to map out where the truth is, but that isn't sufficient to dissuading people or persuading people. And I just think there is a real conundrum between understanding the legitimate resentments that may lie under something that are being turned to illegitimate and explained illegitimately, and the balance in that is very difficult.
It is. So just conscious of time, having just discovered the Q&A panel, I've got 3 questions. I'm going to read them out together, and then we're going to sort of do our best to answer them. The first one is about what Wiener's attitude was to militarism. How might he have responded to a writer like Ernst Jünger? That's from Bernard Baer. From Howard Kordansky, we have a question about many Jews who fought for Germany during the First World War considered themselves German first, Jewish second. To what extent did Wiener share that sentiment? And then lastly, from Andrew Wallace, I'm interested to know if Wiener had any knowledge or refers explicitly or implicitly to the Armenian genocide in his writing. So does anyone among the panel feel ready to take on one of those questions? Danny, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I can take on the question of Jews first, and German first and Jews second. He resolved that conundrum by arguing that the two were indivisible. That there was something about being Jewish that was German in nature, and something about German that was Jewish in nature. And as you said, it strikes me that to some extent, this might be this might have been an intellectual device in his head to resolve contradictions, but he certainly very passionately believed it. And as I said, that he wanted he wanted his funeral service to be in German and Hebrew. Those are the two languages that he specified, and that was what he spent his life on. So that was my side. I unfortunately do not know the answer on the Armenian genocide. That is a fascinating question. It's hard to believe he didn't have a lot of considered thoughts on that, but I just don't know what they were. On the question of militarism, he certainly wasn't a pacifist, and he was proud to serve in the First World War. One of the things that really brings you up against on the futility of the First World War is to know that both my grandparents, my grandfathers, were enthusiastically, certainly in the case of Alfred Wiener, but also Adolf Finkelstein to some extent, were firmly on the other side of the war from Britain. So you think to yourself, well, what was everyone fighting about? It's an extraordinary thing.
Well, I think we've answered the questions as well as we can. Unless Michael, did you, or Jean, did you?
Michael may know about the Armenian.
No, I don't know about that, but I just wanted to say in terms of the military, obviously, he served himself, was extremely proud of it. And he wasn't saying that Germany shouldn't have an army. The problem was he thought that, the military people who didn't disband were politicized in very extreme directions. And one of the things that he was really alarmed about, sorry to have to go to the present, was that many of the people who were still in the army as it existed had these extreme racial and ultranationalist ideas, which he thought, so this is really dangerous, that the right wing has actually infiltrated sort of these military guys, and he saw this as incredibly dangerous. But it wasn't that he was saying, Germany shouldn't have an army, or that it should simply be ruled by the victorious allied powers. That wasn't what he was saying at all. And that's, I'd say, given advertisement for the book, that's part of the reason why it would be really interesting to read it. This is, something that makes very, very clear. It's what was going on with these military people, not say military in itself being a bad thing.
Well, for anyone who is thinking of purchasing the book, which I'm sure many of you are after such a fascinating discussion, there is a link in the chat which you'll be able to get a discounted price using during the next 48 hours. So please do click on that and get hold of your copy. I want to finish by thanking the panel for what's been a really fascinating and enlightening discussion. I want to thank Danny and Michael for the foreword and introduction to the book, which are just so insightful and moving. And I also want to just thank Alfred Wiener, really, for without whom we would not be here, without whom the Wiener Holocaust Library would not be here. It's an amazing resource here for all of us in Russell Square. Come and visit us, come and use these incredible collections. And I look forward to seeing you all there soon as we can open our doors again. But the wonderful thing about the internet is it allows us to do things like this. So I just want to finish off by handing back to Michaela, thanking JW3 again, but yes, thanking all of the panelists for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael Berkowitz, Daniel Finkelstein, Jean Seaton, and Toby Simpson. That was incredible. It was the finest panel that could possibly have been assembled for this. And thank you so much, Granta, as well. And hope to see you all at the library or at JW3, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much for organising it. It was good.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
It was great. Very good to see you all. Bye-bye.